Hi, this is Joe, and welcome back to the shop, and thank you for coming back for another video. I've picked up a Harbor Freight 30-watt, 120-volt soldering iron. I paid right around $5 for this, including tax. And in an earlier video, I did some soldering of various gauge wires. I'm real curious to see just what 30 watts will do, and just how big of a gauge wire we could solder. This soldering iron is very inexpensive. It has a nickel-plated tip on it, and it is not tinned with solder. But the directions do indicate that you should tin it with solder prior to using. So we're going to try that out. Not a heck of a lot of wattage, so I'm curious to see just how big of a wire gauge we can solder with this thing to see if it's worth doing anything. More than likely, probably just some real light gauge wire work. But we're going to test it out. So let's open it up and let's get started. I was able to tin the nickel-plated tip on the soldering iron, so I was rather impressed with that. I thought it would really have a hard time tinning. The soldering iron is now heated up. In the third hand, I have some 24 gauge wire. We're going to start out. This is a rather small gauge wire, and we're going to see if we're going to be able to solder this properly using a 30-watt soldering iron from Harbor Freight. We were very quickly able to solder 24 gauge wire. The solder went on, the wires heated up properly, and we're able to apply the solder to the wires without touching the tip of the soldering iron, and we do have a nice glossy finish on the solder. So 24 gauge, this soldering iron works really well. Let's step up to a 22 gauge wire and see how that goes. We now have 22 gauge wire mounted in the third hand. We have it spliced properly, and now let's see if we can solder this with the 30-watt soldering iron. And with the 22 gauge, we were able to successfully solder the wire. If you notice, the solder flowed nicely. I was able to take the soldering iron and move it along the spliced wire, and the solder flowed out really nice, and it still is glossy. So that's a good indication that we had enough heat to solder 22 gauge. Let's step it up now to an 18 gauge wire and see if we can solder that. I re-tinned the soldering iron, and now we have some 18 gauge wire spliced and mounted in the third hand. Let's try to solder this wire. We were able to solder the 18 gauge wire just fine. The solder flowed out really nice, and the solder is glossy and not dull and crusty, so it looks like 18 gauge looks good. Let's step up to 14 gauge, and in this case we're going to do a butt joint, and we'll see how the soldering iron works with a 14 gauge wire. We have the 14 gauge wire mounted in the third hand. We have the wires butt jointed. Now let's go ahead and see if we can solder 14 gauge wire. We're able to successfully solder 14 gauge wire. It took a little bit longer, but I also noticed that the wire was getting really hot. So that, again, that copper really sucks in the heat. So let's step up and try to do silicone based 14 gauge wire. Let's try to do that. And then I also have some 12 gauge, see what we can do. Let's set that up. This silicone insulated wire is a little thicker, or it appears to be a little thicker, because there's more thinner strands together. Also, the strands are already tinned. They're copper wire tinned with solder, so they appear to be silver in color or aluminum in color, but they're actually just tinned. So let's go ahead and to solder this what appears to be slightly larger 14 gauge, but it's just more strands. .14 gauge wire, thinner strands, appears to be a lot more strands, soldered just fine. It did get a bit warm, but it did not melt the insulation. Let me set up with some 12 gauge wire, and let's try that. I have some 12 gauge wire set up in the third hand. 12 gauge wire is really thick. Even for stranded wire, it doesn't bend very well. So there's the thickness or diameter of this wire is really thick. The technique that I use when I butt joint is I try to get enough solder on the edges of each bundle or each wire, and then I hold it with my hand and try to join it together, and then add a little bit more solder after it cools, heat it back up. So we'll try the 12 gauge wire. I'm curious to see how 12 gauge wire solders with a 30 watt soldering iron. Usually 12 gauge wire is really hard to solder. Let's give it a shot. I was able to solder 12 gauge rather nicely. The wire did get really hot, and if you look really close, the insulation is starting to melt. So we did get that copper wire pretty hot. I would say that if you're going to do 12 gauge and above, you might want to get a higher wattage soldering iron. As you can see, we started to melt the insulation, and according to the other video that I did on soldering, you want to use hottest soldering iron that you can get. Otherwise, that copper really absorbs the heat and it starts melting or burning the insulation. So I would say that 12 gauge might be just about the max for a 30 watt soldering iron. But I'm really impressed with the capabilities of this $5 soldering iron. We were able to weld 12 gauge wire, or I'm sorry, solder 12 gauge wire, and it did solder it quite nicely. The joint is really shiny, as if you saw, the solder was flowing really nicely across all the strands on the wire. The only issue that I saw was I had to hold the soldering iron on for quite some time, and the edges of the insulation are starting to melt through. But again, I'm really impressed with this soldering iron. It did a really good job. $5, really good deal. If you don't have one for your shop, you might want to pick one up. Hope you enjoyed this video. We'll see you next time.